Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We're a consortium of about 75 organizations in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the beginnings of American independence. And our guests today are here to talk about a very important person in the story of the American Revolution. That is James Otis. And actually, there's a great new exhibit put together by Revolutionary Spaces and the National Museum of Mental Health Project, Patriot, Hero, Distracted Person, James Otis Jr. and Mental Health in the 18th Century. I'll briefly introduce our four guests and let each of them talk about their particular role in putting this together. We have Gerald Holland. Dr. Holland is a 20-year veteran of the United States Coast Guard, and he now teaches in Smithfield, Virginia. And he's written his dissertation on James Otis, which is called Lightning Bolt of Liberty, the Legacy of James Otis and His Role. So thank you for joining us, Gerald, Dr. Holland.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have Paul Piwko, who is the co-developer of the National Museum of Mental Health Project, and we'll be talking more about that in a few minutes. Paul, thanks so much for tuning in.
Thank you, Bob.
And we have Kate LaPine, who is a museum curator and a scholar researcher. Kate, thanks for joining us. You would help put this exhibit together.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And Lucy Pollock from Revolutionary Spaces. So Lucy, thanks so much.
Happy to be here.
So, Gerald, why don't you tell us a bit about who James Otis was, why he is important, and perhaps why he is not one of the best remembered figures of the Revolutionary era?
Certainly. In the post-revolutionary years, John Adams, beginning around 1815, started to document the revolutionary period. And through his notes and through his diaries and his correspondence, he reflected back to February 1761, where he was an eyewitness to James Otis arguing against the writs of assistance. Writs of assistance were basically an open search warrant, which allowed British customs officials to enter anyone's home or warehouse or what have you to search for smuggled goods. Otis ends up losing the case. The verdict was passed down in November of 1761. But John Adams gives credit to Otis for being the first person to really get the ball rolling in terms of American colonists examining their role as part of the English Empire or the British Empire. And from there on in the 1760s, Otis plays either the first or second leading role with the Sons of Liberty to really get the revolutionary thinking going. He writes several pamphlets that advocates for Englishmen's rights as natural-born English citizens. Some of those pamphlets are a little controversial because his rhetoric, which may have been part of his mental illness, flip-flops very, very often, flip-flops in his rhetoric, arguing that Parliament has the power to tax the colonies, but they don't have the right to tax the colonies. Unfortunately for Otis, his downward spiral will climax in 1769 with the coffeehouse brawl that he gets in against John Robinson, just down from where the State House is now in Boston. And from there on, he's out of the scene of the revolution. No one really bats an eye at the contributions of Otis thereafter. But in 1815, when John Adams starts to rehash his memories, that's when the legacy of Otis starts to come to play. 1823, William Tudor publishes the first major biography on Tudor. And really, it's the only major biography solely dedicated to James Otis. So that's part of the reason why I wrote my dissertation, and part of the reason I want to turn it into the next modern biography on Otis.
Does his sister, Mercy Otis Warren, write about him in her History of the Revolution?
She does, but it's very biased. just like
Oh,
the works
sure.
just like the letters of Adams and a few other pieces of correspondence that I found from other people that mention Otis by name. But the history is very biased based on Mercy's recollections.
I might just chime in that Otis burned his records, his papers at least twice. So we're dependent on other voices to tell the story.
When does he burn them?
There was an incident in 1764, I believe. Then the second burning occurs just before his death in 1783.
And then he's actually struck by lightning, and the house he's in is burned. Is that right?
Correct.
So go on, Gerald.
In the course of our research, there apparently is a letter, or was a letter, from James to Mercy, where he more or less said that if and when the time comes, may it be by the hand of God, may I be struck by lightning.
Wow. And at this time, he's living in Andover. He's been first declared a distracted person and then removed from Boston because of his mental decline. Can we talk a little bit about Andover, what he's doing there? Maybe Lucy, you can tell us a bit about this.
Sure. So definitely we're seeing that start of the mental decline with the caning on September 5th of 1769. And, for a few days, it seems like he may be okay. And then his personality starts to change pretty drastically. He was this clear, concise, cogent orator for most of his life. And pretty quickly things start to go downhill and he no longer can maintain, clear conversations with people. John Adams has a really great quote where he says that Otis rambles like a ship without a helm. He's just kind of lost and aimless. So that's kind of the start when people believe maybe we need to be giving this guy a little bit more special attention. And things kind of keep getting worse throughout the 1770s. Right after the Boston Massacre, I think it's a week after the Boston Massacre, which is a hugely traumatic event for the citizens of Boston, James Otis has what's kind of referred to as his infamous mad freak, where he goes to the townhouse, which is now the old State House. And I believe he puts a brick through every single one of the windows in that building. And that building has an annoying amount of windows as the people who have to clean them. There are very many windows there. So he has a great amount of dedication, but it kind of shows the mental turmoil that he's going through. We don't know why he does that. And then there's an instance, I think a few weeks later, where he fires guns out of the second floor of his building. So it's all really a period of, we don't know what's going on in his mind, but to the people around him, it's kind of embarrassing. He's this great figure who suddenly had this pretty quick mental decline, and partially maybe to kind of get him out of the public eye, but also for his own benefit. They then start a series of basically boarding out Otis a couple of different times over the next decade or so. But 1771, I believe he's removed just briefly to an unspecified countryside location. He spends some time in Hull or Hingham today. He spends most of the American Revolution in his hometown of Barnstable with his father and his brother Joseph. And once his father dies in 1778, there's really no one there to take care of Otis. His older brother, Samuel Lane, who had been his guardian up to that point, he is now off, founding a new nation and dealing with all the issues that happen when you have an American Revolution, right? So they bring him up to a trusted place in Andover. We don't really know why Andover. We can make some good speculations, but he stays there from about, I think it's early 1779 through to his death in 1783. So 4 years, it's the longest he's ever boarded anywhere. But in Andover, we see kind of a different culture than we have in Boston. Firstly, Otis is physically and mentally removed from all of the challenges that come from living in a space of political hotbed, especially one where you've seen your highest highs with the writs of assistance case, but also, your lowest lows as well. So even just physically removing him from that area was surely tremendously helpful for him. We also have the Osgood family. They're some of the original settlers of Andover. And a great many of them are patriots or really influential community members. And the prospect of boarding Otis with the Osgoods gives him, kind of a financial security. These are people who are going to be able to support him. It is being paid for out of James Otis's estate. But, there are these people who can really support him in this political time. But also many of them are physicians, or they are, clergy members, or not clergy members, but they're members of their churches as well.
Right.
So they're able to provide spiritual and physical care for him while also being, political supporters of his. So it's an important family to board with as well. And then
What kind of, if I can ask Lucy before you get to the next point, what kind of protocols of treatment were there for people with mental illness in the 1700s?
It's a good question. We don't have a whole lot of specifics about what people are doing. I can toss us way back to Cotton Mather's time when he writes, I think it's The Angel of Bethesda, which is this manifesto of how to treat different illnesses. And one of them is mental illness, which is really interesting. It brings us this idea that colonists did believe that this was a treatable thing. There were tangible solutions to it. But one of them I remember from his book is to cut open a pheasant and put it on someone's head. So listen, there's a range of what people think is an acceptable treatment. But we think by the time of James Otis's, treatment, we're talking probably things like isolation, a lot of prayer. You may have some, herbal remedies or something of that sort, but really it's being removed from the situation. That's what we see the most with more affluent families, is just removing them from the place that is causing them the emotional turmoil. So I wish I had a bit of a better answer there. But I can say also that in Andover at the time, there were 2 physicians at least who specialized in psychiatric, what we would call today psychiatric treatment, which were Dr. Daniel Howe, who's actually very famous over Massachusetts. Even the provincial Congress knows about him in 1775. So he's very famous for treating mental illness. And then a man, Dr. Thomas Kitteridge as well. They're both well-known mental health treaters at the time, healers. So we don't know, if James Otis ever saw Dr. Kitteridge. We know he saw Dr. Howe, but we're not sure how many times. And what those treatments actually entailed, we don't know either. But that could have been another motivation for him to move up to Andover, because there are so many physicians there who value treating mental health.
Right. Yeah. When Paul, you're co-creator of the National Museum of Mental Health project. Maybe you can weigh in a bit on this.
Yeah, I was just wondering aloud. There's a term that I'd never heard prior to about 30 days ago: touch grass. And I think many of us have heard this term, this idea of getting outside and the potential curative power of being in nature. And so, Lucy, would you agree that there were some instances, or that there is some evidence that would indicate that even in colonial times, there was this belief that not just being removed from the stress and the strain of the city, but being out in nature and being out in country could be helpful, particularly if one was wealthy enough or had means and could afford that form of treatment?
Yeah, I think things like farm work would have been seen as a particularly obvious way to help people with mental illnesses. One of the other treatments, this is great to bring up, at the time was giving them repetitive, kind of monotonous tasks so that they could still be important to their communities and feel like they were, being a part of their society, while also not giving them anything that would have been too mentally strenuous. So picking oakum was one of the big ones in Boston proper. And then out in places like Andover, where you have the ability to take folks that maybe in the time being, the thought was that they needed something to do that was easy enough but still productive. Farm work would have been the obvious choice. And he did live on the Osgoods farm. I believe they also had like a cider house distillery there. James Otis, unfortunately, famously abuses alcohol, so maybe not the best place for him, but certainly another source of that repetitive kind of hands-on work that I think being in nature does provide. Yeah.
Professor Allison, I would just want to add to that. His wife, Ruth Cunningham Otis, was a very staunch loyalist. And so one reason that he wasn't staying at home with her was there was strife domestically. So it was probably a little calmer to get away from that.
Yeah, and his youngest daughter as well, Betsy, was a staunch loyalist.
Yeah.
She ends up marrying a British, I think, lieutenant who was wounded at Bunker Hill. And then after he recuperates in Boston, they go back to England where he's reassigned. I did want to make note that there was an attempt in the 1760s by Thomas Hancock to fund the first mental institution in Boston. He bequeathed in his will money to that construction, but the General Court did not take the money and use it as he saw fit. So as far as I know, the relocation of individuals to either a beach town down in Hull or a farm town up in Andover was the most common treatment. And while Otis was in Hull, he became kind of that, I wouldn't say the creepy old man, but he was that the quiet old man who told stories to the kids and walked along the beach quietly. And he became a figure in the town, not to the point where people stayed away from him, but he was certainly just comfortable and quiet and trying to rest and recuperate.
He had been, I mean, as you said, Gerald, he was a brilliant lawyer, and he had been a brilliant student at Harvard. And so, and of course, his father was a very important political figure, had been Speaker of the House. And are there any indications earlier about this trouble, or are there any other indications in the family?
No other mental illness in the family that I discovered. But there is a letter from, I believe, his first youngest brother to their father, James Otis Sr., basically saying that, something's not right with Big Brother. And I want to say that letter was like 1746 or so soon after Otis graduates from Harvard. While he was at Harvard, he's known as being the student who is buried in the books. Never really, for whatever social, outpourings there would have been in Cambridge at that time, he was buried in the books. And honestly, I don't believe that he would have become a lawyer if it hadn't been for the pressure of his father. I think the pressure from James Otis Sr. Is a contributing factor to his decline mentally because of mainly the stress. I think that if Otis had his way, he would have become a professor at Harvard, would have just stayed low, taught the classes, and done his own thing. But his father more or less forced him to become a lawyer. And I think the gradual stress, especially once senior and junior enter politics together in the late 1750s, just really kicked the mental decline.
And we're talking about James Otis, and there's a new exhibit, an online exhibit put together by Revolutionary Spaces and the National Museum of Mental Health Project called Patriot Hero, Distracted Person, James Otis Jr. and Mental Health in the 18th Century. And the exhibit also makes this point in 1760 when Thomas Hutchinson becomes the Chief Justice instead of the senior Otis, that the senior Otis had a long experience in politics, seems to take this in stride, but James Otis Jr., this is one of these turning moments where he sees Otis as the focus of evil. Hutchinson as the focus of evil, and really does seem to change him. And you can see this even without looking at his later mental decline.
Yeah, you really start to see Otis bringing out the Enlightenment thinking of Montesquieu, especially with the separation of powers. And John Adams refers to that as well in the late 1750s, early 1760s. So the use of the Enlightenment thinking by Otis and Adams and the other primary figures of the 1760s kind of brings to the forefront the political side, especially targeted against Hutchinson and Bernard, Francis Bernard.
And in his, no, go on, Gerald.
in retrospect, I think that, if James Otis Sr. had not been as involved, that Otis and Hutchinson probably would have gotten along.
Interesting.
In a weird kind of way. I see Hutchinson as he watches Otis decline. He, like everyone else, recognizes the genius, but he also empathizes with the fact that this guy is on a downward spiral.
And his speech in the writs of assistance case, I mean, as you said, he burned his papers, so we just have copies of things. And much of that we have because John Adams later on wrote down what he remembered. I mean, in your study, how much of this do you think is what Otis said, and how much is it what Adams, in retrospect, was recalling, in retrospect of having a revolution, which he said began then and there, the child independence was born?
The first publication of Adams' notes regarding the writs is in the Massachusetts Spy. I believe it's in March or April 1773. But the use of Adams' letters from 1818 is what I primarily used for the material. I would say that Adams' recollections were probably a little far-fetched, or at least declining. And I think Adams was attempting more to advocate the proper place of Otis in the revolution's history versus the actual verbiage that was used in the case. Adams was a fanboy. I mean, he really was. Otis supported him as a lawyer when Adams was approaching the bar. So I think Adams was just trying to do his due diligence. You see that with Adams' correspondence with William Wirt, who had written the biography of Patrick Henry, arguing that Patrick Henry had been the one who started the revolution 4 years after the writs of assistance case.
So was it that precipitates Adams into bringing back Otis, the fact that Henry and Virginia are getting credit for something that Adams didn't think they deserved?
That was part of it, because at that time you had the regional conflicts between New England and Virginia primarily over who had a bigger role in the revolution. It starts in Massachusetts. It ends literally 20 minutes from my house. But was it in 1761 or was it in 1765?
I'm glad we've resolved that question.
And then you have people like Landon Carter, who was from the famous Carter family here in Virginia, who claimed himself to be the originator of the revolution, because he wrote a short pamphlet in December 1764 speaking out against the Stamp Act. So you have one guy.
Of course, at the same time, Otis is writing his pamphlet about the Sugar Act. And
correct.
So he's got...
Yeah.
I think there's a piece to be said for, I love John Adams. I think he's very funny. He's a deeply selfish individual too, especially as we're going into the 1800s. I mean, he's just come off of 2 decades later, this hugely tumultuous presidency, right? Where he doesn't come out looking super good. And he's, in a way, I think, also trying to reinforce his legitimacy as one of these American founding fathers. And, of course, he writes the Massachusetts State Constitution, which I believe is like the most important document ever written in American history, but I'm biased being from Massachusetts. But he takes, the writs of assistance argument and incorporates that into this, written document, which is incredible in itself that it's a governing document that's written down. So I think in securing Otis's place, he's also saying, well, I was there from the beginning and, I saw these arguments. Here I am. And there's a great moment in the letters as William Tudor is writing the biography, where they're talking about Otis's controversial pamphlets from 64 and 65. And John Adams says, never was a man more hated in the history of Boston than James Otis Jr. was in that moment.
Wow.
That can't really be true because they sent him to the Stamp Act Congress a few weeks later, right? So there's a little bit of a liberty taken by Adams, who, of course, in the 1800s has no reason to lie about how badly someone else looks in the face of their own country.
Right. And then, of course, he's critical of Otis's sister, Mercy Otis Warren. He said when, in her history, he says when her brother does something, there's a chapter about it, but then she leaves out a lot of other people, notably John Adams, which is...
Well, everyone can be salty about each other.
No, that's very true. I mean, we're dealing with real people here and not simply abstract ideas. And Paul, I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the National Museum of Mental Health project, which you have launched, and can you tell us a bit about what it is that you're hoping to do?
So in many ways, we start with a simple presumption that there should be a National Museum of Mental Health. Right. Mm-hmm. We call ourselves a project because we're not there yet.
Okay.
And so that work, comes from the idea that the nation is ready for such an institution, but not one that purely looks back in history, but that can examine mental health through cultural and creative lenses and historical lenses in the here and now for the betterment of the here and now. Mm-hmm. And in a way, the connection to Otis between the work that I've been doing kind of comes out of left field in a way. In 2022, we gave a presentation at a National Park Service virtual event where we talked about a pattern of innovation and national influence that has come from Massachusetts and Rhode Island over the course of centuries,
right.
To a point where, if you look across time and you look at, again, from almost an innovative perspective, advances as it relates to mental health and wellness, you can tell a story that we think justifies this name, America's Mental Health and Wellness Corridor. And so it was in that National Park Service presentation where we first used that name. And a lot of what we've been doing has been scoping research in the context of innovation. And we can essentially thread together, we had, prior to Otis, been able to thread together from maybe the Dorothea Dix era through Worcester State Hospital, through the only time Freud ever speaking in America, him choosing not Boston or New York, but Clark University in Worcester, through John Kabat-Zinn and mindfulness making its way into the mainstream and meditation. And so we can tell this story and connect these dots across time. However, we've always wondered, why has so much of this innovation taken place west of the city, west of Boston, particularly concentrated in Worcester County. And then last year, I met Kate at the New England Museum Association conference. And we started talking about this history, and it was sort of like a game of Go Fish. You got any stories about mental health and wellness in Boston? And immediately Otis, came into the discussion. And as we started hearing about Otis and then learning about his boarding out, this idea, the practice that Otis was a part of sending people who were experiencing mental illness out into the country, we started realizing we might be finding our why in terms of why so much innovation as it relates to mental health outside of the city, when there's been so much innovation as it relates to medical health inside the city. And so we became particularly curious in Otis initially due to his farming out, his boarding out to Andover. And we learned, after learning about Otis, that the same was true of Paul Revere's son-in-law. He went to a doctor in Uxbridge, again, to be treated for mental illness. The same was true of, I believe it was a nephew of John Hancock, who went to this same doctor in Uxbridge. And so suddenly we find ourselves looking and thinking about mental health in the context of the colonial period. And so this America's Mental Health and Wellness Corridor effort connects to an effort from the Smithsonian. We are inspired by a lot of work done in a Places of Invention exhibition. And we've gotten some help from the Smithsonian in terms of trying to explore this history, this innovation history as it relates to mental health, with the goal of holding it up to encourage discussions about mental health in the here and now that can benefit us in the here and now.
Interesting. And going back to, of course, the Massachusetts Constitution, which calls on the towns to cherish education. We also have Horace Mann in the 1820s and 1830s really looking at ways of using the state to support the mentally ill in the towns. So, fun story there.
Yeah.
So how did this exhibit, this exhibit came together through a conversation you, Paul and Kate had at the New England Museum Association. And so then can you tell us a bit about this Patriot Hero Distracted Person exhibit? It's online. Is there plans of putting it into a physical exhibit?
So Kate, Lucy, do you want to come in now if we're talking about the exhibition?
I think Kate is best equipped to talk about this.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, to answer your second question first, at the moment, we don't have any plans to make it a permanent physical exhibit because, well, to be honest, there are not that many artifacts. And so I think it would not lend itself particularly well to observing that. The title of the exhibit came from Lucy and I going back and looking at some of the writings that Otis had, that we actually have published of his, and now that we just had that conversation about the transcription of the writs of assistance, I'm perhaps doubting what we have called it, but let's just put that a little asterisk there. In a version of the writs of assistance speech, he talks about the greatest effort that a man can bring about. The only principles of public conduct that are worthy of a gentleman or a man are to sacrifice estate, ease, health, and applause, and even life to the sacred cause of his country. These manly sentiments in private life make the good citizen, in public life, the patriot and the hero. So we took a look at that and sort of said, well, he obviously wanted to be considered a patriot and a hero, and he didn't perhaps intend to sacrifice all those things in pursuit of his vision for the colonies, but in fact he does. And so that was the origin story of the title.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So. And
distracted person was what the colonists would call someone with mental illness. That was sort of, there are other terms as well, but just we kind of like that one, and it has kindness behind it. It's not calling someone a maniac or
right, yeah.
And we also really liked the way that the colonial society seemed to embrace folks of across the spectrum. If they had the ability to contribute to the society, they were encouraged to do so. And folks recognized James Otis's brilliance and his ability as an attorney and statesman, and they kept trying to keep him in the public eye whenever possible. Like they would bring him back and have him be the moderator of town meeting and things like that, even if he wasn't really fully using all of his faculties.
No, it is interesting how many times he is brought back for functions, and he's one of the drafters of the 1772 Boston Report. And then I'm told that in 1783 he makes an appearance at the town meeting where he proposes, instead of commemorating March 5th, we should commemorate July 4th. Lucy's nodding, so I guess I got that right.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know that he proposed it, but I think he was on the committee that proposed it, which, I assumed in 1783 we're talking about kind of a ceremonial position.
Yeah.
But even if that's the case, and if Otis doesn't come up with it himself, the fact that he's included intentionally in that committee speaks volumes about what people at the time believed he had contributed to the revolutionary cause.
Yeah, his last visit to Boston is late April of 1783. He's invited by John Hancock, who was the governor at that time, and being on that committee. And I think he's in town for maybe a week. But the stress gets to him to the point where they have to get him out of town again because he just couldn't handle it.
Really fascinating story, tragic story. Anything else we should say about Otis or the exhibit or what we've learned about mental illness or looking at his story?
I think sorry, Paul, you go for it.
Well, I have a personal reflection that is not necessarily discussed in the exhibit, but I my interest, as I said, came maybe out of left field. Otis, his treatment and that context. And yet, the more I thought into and examined the writs of assistance and the arguments that were being made, and the fundamental essence of freedom, particularly freedom from fear, right? Dr. Holland was talking about an open search warrant. And the notion of, what are the building blocks that allow any of us to be well mentally and potentially achieve peace of mind, and the idea of having the possibility of a quiet space, having the possibility of a meditative space where we can be alone and we can trust all five of us here. No one's going to come barging in. I really think can't be discounted. And so when I think of Otis now, I think of Otis as in some way as connecting to this gift of freedom that allows for the possibility of peace of mind and mental health. And so in his own way, maybe you could frame Otis as an innovator as it relates to mental health, even though his own suffered quite poorly.
Right. So he is really the father of the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable searches and seizures, which is, again, goes back to the writs of assistance case. Now, his brother-in-law, James Warren, Mercy's husband, suggested he might have been at Bunker Hill, but I'll leave it to the historians to shoot that one down.
Gerald, I'll toss it to you.
All right. I'm actually typing in the chat about that right now. In the Massachusetts list of soldiers that fought in the Revolution, there's roughly 9 to 11 different James Otises listed. But James Otis Jr. Is only listed as a militia officer in Barnstable. And that's during the period where he's there resting and recuperating at the family home. So I think it was more of an honorary position versus an active position. But in regards to him being at Bunker Hill, I found absolutely nothing to solidify that.
And his brother Joseph was a captain of the Barnstable militia.
Correct.
And any further thought? Lucy, you have a further word for us on James Otis?
Yeah, I think I would. I don't have much more about Bunker Hill. I think Gerald covered that very well. But I think the thing that to me makes this story really relevant, particularly now, because I think anybody could do an exhibit on this or write a book about this at any time. But I think these years kind of are critical for us right now as we're approaching our 250th. And I think it's because, at least for myself, and I think other people can relate to this as well, I have always seen the generation of founding fathers as this kind of untouchable echelon of people who are always brave, who never do the things that make us like humans, things that we are that are imperfect, like things like drinking a lot, or hiding away from conflict with our family, or being vindictive to people in letters. Like, we don't think of founding fathers as doing that, but we do those kinds of things as humans. And I think for me, what makes James Otis so compelling is that he does do all of those things. He's an incredibly important person in the foundation of our nation, and he is imperfect, very outwardly so. Everyone knows that this guy is no Thomas Jefferson or John Adams.
Speaking of perfect people,
maybe not. I know I chose two really good perfect people, huh? But you know what I mean to say, that he's very obviously human, just like in the way that the founding fathers don't always get portrayed. And I think when we allow James Otis and the other founding fathers to be imperfect humans, we allow ourselves to be imperfect and be okay with that. And in that way, allow ourselves to be our own generation of founding folks, right? Sure. People who are still able to contribute to their society, even though we may feel deeply imperfect as people. So that's why he's always been relevant to me and really resonated with me. So I hope that anyone who's listening feels similarly about this really cool dude.
That's great. Kate, any further thoughts on
one final thought?
Yes, Paul.
So this notion of resonance also has, there's been some creative resonance as it relates to the Otis story. And so first off, much respect to Lucy and Kate for their leadership with the exhibition. We have also displayed some creative works that have been inspired by their work and Otis's story, including an original song that's called Fanning the Flame. Have you heard of James Otis? And so in among the historical aspects of the exhibition, there's a page that displays some creative works that celebrate us. And just
it's really interesting, the range of the exhibition. What do you think? Kate, any final thoughts for us?
No, nothing else. Thank you.
Okay. How about you, Dr. Holland, author of the book, the soon-to-be book, Lightning Bolt of Liberty? Any further concluding words on James Otis?
Well, originally, when I got into the dissertation on Otis, it was to highlight his role in the revolution. But after spending 3.5 to 4 years with the guy, we formed a bond. I mean, Lucy can attest to it. When I was in Boston in August, I celebrated with his rock by giving it a big old hug there at Greenery Burial Ground, because I'd spent a lot of time with the guy. And as much as I wanted to focus on his revolutionary role, I started to really become personal with him, and really started to empathize with the fact that he gave up so much mentally and physically towards this cause. I mean, we hear of Washington paying out of pocket, at Valley Forge. But Otis really did give everything he had until he couldn't. And in the years where he couldn't, there were moments where he was still tried. The case of the Massachusetts Constitution, Otis argued against it. So
the 1778 Constitution, not the
correct
1781.
I think it was the first one.
That's true.
But over time, I really began to appreciate him as a person, not as a historical figure, but as a person. And I think, hopefully, if my dissertation becomes a book, more people will figure that out. That sure, he was important in the historical context, but also in the regards of mental health and what that can do to a person as they try for what they deem is right.
Well, thank you all for sharing this. We've been talking with 4 folks involved in creating the online exhibit Patriot, Hero, Distracted Person, James Otis Jr. and Mental Health in the 18th Century. So I want to thank Paul Piwko from the National Museum of Mental Health Project and Dr. Gerald Holland, author of Lightning Bolt of Liberty, as well as Lucy Pollock and Kate LaPine, who have helped create this online exhibit and done other research on this. So thank you all so much. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, the man behind the curtain. And every week we thank folks from different places who are tuning in regularly. And if you're from one of these places and want some Revolution 250 swag, send Jonathan an email at jlane@revolution250.org. Or if you're not from one of these places and just want to contact Jonathan, jlane@revolution250.org. He welcomes comments, questions, ideas. And so this week, I want to thank our listeners in Saint-Germain-en-Laye and Yvelines, France, and in Christiansburg, Virginia. I don't know if that's near where you are, Gerald, as well as in Edinburgh and Schaumburg, Illinois, Edinburgh in Scotland, Manchester, England, Manchester, New Hampshire, Falkenstein in Saxony, Flourtown, Pennsylvania, Yarmouth and Harwich, a nod to Lucy, North Andover and Andover, a nod to James Otis, as well as Hamburg, New York, Thermopolis, Wyoming, and Sydney in New South Wales. And thank you to everyone listening, points between and beyond. And now we'll be marched out on the road to Boston.